The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to this episode of the Quest Podcast with me, Danny Lawler. If you're new to the Quest Podcast, do make sure to hit the subscribe button and also like and share with your pals as well, if that's what you want to do. We'd like that very much. For this episode of the Quest Podcast, my guest is Gerry Brady. Now, Gerry is, an elder statesman of the funds industry here in Ireland, and I have cleared it with him. He said that's okay for me to say. Gerry is somebody who has vast experience of the Irish industry right back to its conception and its early days in the late 80s through to today. And he has certainly views on all of that he's willing to share and gladly does so in this episode. So we chat about the early days of the financial services industry in Ireland, what it was that attracted firms to come and establish funds in Ireland, and how the various government agencies work together to try and grow an industry out of, as Gerry describes, not knowing a fund from a hole in the ground to being one of the key international financial services centres for the domicile of investment funds. So we chat about that, but we also look forward. We chat about the current Department of Finance Fund Sector 2030 consultation or review that they're performing, and I guess some of the risks that exist for the industry here that could cause us some speed bumps in the future if we're not very careful to keep our eyes open for them. So with that, as I said, a very interesting and broad-ranging conversation, let's get on with the show.
The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, Gerry, and welcome to the Quest Podcast. I'm delighted to have you on the show.
Great to be here, Danny. Thanks for the invitation.
Am I allowed to call you an elder statesman of the Irish funds industry? Does that go too far?
No. Sadly, the last time I looked in the mirror, I got a shock. So yes, you may do so.
Well, without getting too misty-eyed, Gerry, how do you look back on the funds industry here? Because I guess a little bit like peace in Northern Ireland, people who've grown up with a generation who have only known peace. Here in our industry, you've people who've only grown up knowing there being a funds industry in Ireland and a financial services industry, but it wasn't always like that.
No, I think, we're going through testing times at the moment with the general housing situation and so on. But, the Ireland that I grew up in, the Ireland that I started working in, the Ireland that I left in the late 80s was totally bankrupt. And we were in a vicious circle that I believed we would never get out of. And I left Ireland to work abroad with the hope I could get back. But, the back of my mind was the fear that just wouldn't happen. And the marginal rate of taxation in the late 80s was 72.5%.
Wow.
You had 65% PAYE and then PRSI 7.5%. And the astronomical level of taxation that a young guy would pay his government, 72.5%, was 8,500 Irish punts. So it was an appalling situation that we were living in. We couldn't keep Irish people in the country, let alone attract non-Irish people. And I really didn't believe that we would break out of this vicious circle. We had borrowed in all these low interest rate currencies like the Swiss franc and the Deutschmark. And after every draconian budget, when we totted up the books, we were worse off than at the start of the financial year. So that was kind of the backdrop to all of this. So I'm working for this great financial institution, Bank of Bermuda, in Bermuda. And I'm hearing talk about something called an international financial services center.
Did you think somebody was pulling your leg, Gerry?
I guess, no, I took it seriously. Ireland PLC worked so well in those days. It still probably does today, but, we recognized we were so far down the pecking order that first and foremost, we had to sell the jurisdiction. Then we could look at maybe getting some of the business for ourselves. So we always worked very well together. I remember a guy, Pat Tolan, in the IDA, who I was friendly with, would visit Bermuda and other places every so often. So I kind of bought into it, but, it was just like one of the many initiatives that you hear bounced around from time to time. Like, until I left Ireland to join Bank of Bermuda, I wouldn't have known an investment fund or a mutual fund from a hole in the ground. international treasury operations was like pie in the sky. So we were a very domestic type of country, of economy, very inward looking. So international finance had just really passed us by. But it sounded good. And I got in on it at an early stage with loads of other Irish people working abroad. And the thesis was brilliant. Like, loads of countries had gold or oil or natural commodities. And to this day, we still produce young people, babies. We had very high birth rates, and we had a good educational system. So we tried to get our children educated, to come through the system and then come out of college with no work. So the basic issue and problem we had, despite our abundance of this magnificent resource, young people, the primary problem we had was a hemorrhaging of educated young people leaving the country. So the IFSC was conceived to stop the hemorrhaging of educated young people. Everyone else was benefiting. We weren't. We'd educated, fed, watered them, got them to a certain stage. And then lo and behold, they left us. And I guess the other objective, and this is where Customs House development, the IFSC got its name, was the regeneration of the inner city. So those were kind of the twin driving forces, and it all made sense. We didn't, it didn't make sense for us even in those days to try and compete with low cost jurisdictions and heavy manufacturing. What we needed to do was to leverage of the fact we had a young population and an educated population. And if you kind of looked around, your financial services seemed to offer the best option. So I kind of bought into it. I don't know at what stage I crossed that line, but I bought into it reasonably early on.
And what were the agencies involved in kind of conceiving and then pushing that idea and telling the world about it?
I have to say, as always, we are so well served by one of the most magnificent marketing organizations in the world, the IDA. So the IDA was very prominent in this. And, the IDA at a very early stage could see the benefits of moving from its Shannon free development manufacturing type scenario to potentially setting up something on international finance that would maybe have more of a Dublin focus and a West of Ireland type focus. But the funds industry, I forget the various iterations we went through before we got as far as Irish funds, but the fund industry itself as a group worked together. And, the great thing about the international funds industry is we have these conferences all the time, and generally they're not in Bournemouth or Isle of Man, they're in Monaco or they're in New York or they're in Palm Desert, they're in lovely locations. And from an early stage, the two driving forces would have been the sort of the emerging funds industry, international funds industry, the various practitioners, the audit firms, the law firms, and the IDA. Like I do recall a wonderful guy in the IDA in New York. He would be at every conference, but we'd only see him at the coffee break because the budget was so tight that that there wasn't a budget to attend all these high-priced conferences. But he would be there at every coffee break, and it was a great team effort where we were really, really trying very hard to show that there was an alternative to Luxembourg, because clearly around this time there was legislation, regulatory reform. So it's fine for Ireland to embark in this, but really there were a few forces that came together at the same time, which worked to our advantage. The UCITS legislation, unit trust legislation, which we passed in Ireland, but essentially it was the UCITS legislation. And while
was that a happy accident, Gerry, or was that by design, that UCITS directive, which came 85 into force 89, and the Irish funds, National Services Centre, that they coincided in time?
Yeah. Like the 87 was the creation of the IFSC, 89, the unit trust legislation, 90, I believe, was the UCITS. So it all happened around the same time. I do believe it was a happy accident. Like the story I've been told, and I believe it, is that there are loads my opinion, the architect of the Good Friday Agreement is John Hume. There's loads of other people that deserve credit, but if I were to kind of look at it, I would attribute it to John Hume. So creation of and success of the IFSC, the story I've been given, we've got to think beyond the box, beyond the traditional Shannon free development manufacturing type approach. We've got to look at services, and financial services would probably offer a great opportunity to for our young people, and hopefully offer them opportunities to stay in Ireland rather than go abroad for work. So Dermot Desmond conceived the International Financial Services Centre. To his credit, and sadly, there are black marks there as well, but to his credit, Haughey was that stubborn politician who said, yeah, this is a good idea, we'll go with it. And as I understand it, I wasn't in Ireland at the time, faced ridicule in his own party, let alone the opposition and the media and so on. And then there was an individual that I had the great pleasure of working with for many, many years. He served on the board of Bank of Bermuda in Ireland, Pádraig O'Higgins, who is the most astute, or was the most astute businessman that I have ever come across. And he was a hard-nosed civil servant that knocked heads together. And I was regaled by many stories from Pádraig of those days where, we had massive inflation, massive unemployment, massive, as I said, taxation and immigration. And, the story Pádraig would tell me of getting the three parties together, the government, the business, the unions. So, the unions would say, look, we want, inflation is 17%, we need 10% wage rises. And Pádraig would say, look, you're getting 3%. And the employers would say, well, that's a more reasonable approach. That's great now, but we're under extreme pressure now. There'll be layoffs. And Pádraig would say, there are no layoffs. And the government said, well, look, we've got to go back now and check this with all the various departments. He said, no one's leaving this room until we all agree. Now, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but this, these stories that Pádraig would tell me of those days were quite clearly everyone's interests were pulling in a different direction, but the country was bankrupt. And unless there was drastic action, and that was, the foundation of the pact that we have, the social understanding and so on between all the constituencies in the country, and we all pulled together. We gave a bit, and we got a bit. So it to me, what has happened in Ireland, and clearly Europe as well, and pouring money into Ireland and given us this IFSC tax status recognition, 10% tax rate. There are a whole host of factors that came together, but it is a remarkable economic success story. It really is, from a country that was truly bankrupt, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And as you think back and reflect, are there any kind of milestones that were hit on the way that really gave the industry a boost, let it find its feet, and then grow into what it is today?
There may be, Danny, none kind of come to mind. Like I do, when I look back at the growth of our industry, we had no history of international finance. We hadn't a bull's notion what was happening. Now, there were some things that were sensible that sadly we ended up shooting ourselves in the foot. We live in a populist, democratic world where, everyone believes they have a divine right to offer their opinion and to determine the future direction of government and so on and so forth. But in order to get this off the ground, we needed expertise. And who in their right mind is going to come to Ireland to pay 72.5% tax on a Mickey Mouse salary? So how are we going to get all these experienced leaders of international finance to come and help us? And we had this thing called the remittance basis of taxation, which made perfect sense. So I'm a non-Irish national and I'm being attracted to Ireland. I want to set up a nice home in Ireland, send the children to school in Ireland, go out for meals in Ireland. So I want a good salary in Ireland, which sadly will be taxed in Ireland, and I'll pay that tax. But the rest of my compensation and bonuses and so on as a non-Irish national, as long as that was paid outside the jurisdiction, was not remitted back to the jurisdiction, it wasn't taxed in the jurisdiction, So to my mind, that made perfect sense then, makes perfect sense now, but we repealed that legislation a while back. But that certainly was a big, big factor in us securing the services of these experienced leaders of business that came to the outer edges of Europe to set up, to help us set up this fledgling international financial center. But in all of that, in the early days, we were seen, I suppose, very much as a little bit of a tax play, that's always helpful, but more sort of a back office service center where with these educated young people that had no experience, no insight into the industry, so had to be led, had to be trained, had to be managed. But the thinking in a lot of instances was, don't let these guys get in front of the clients. So what we'll do is we'll have them in a back office. We'll call the back office Ireland, and with technology and so on and so forth, this will work to our great advantage, and won't everybody be happy? But what happened, Danny, was remarkable. Like, one thing about the Irish is, by and large, we're not shy. By and large, we can have a conversation with a stranger. By and large, our interpersonal skills are very good. And clients being clients and keen to know what's going on and so on and so forth. As time went on, clients expressed an interest in doing more in Ireland and liaising more with Ireland. And their experience of Ireland was really, really positive and good. So we evolved from being this back office support center, not to be seen or heard, into more of a client-centric, client-facing servicing center. And so I think that transformation, but I think that evolved rather than, there being a big bang at some stage or a big event. I think that evolved, and I think it's underscored our tremendous success. Like you recall, even in your youthful years, you recall minimum activities, where the great fear was that, look, why are we doing this? We're doing this to stop emigration. We're doing this to stop the hemorrhaging of young people. So under no circumstances, if a client believes that, look, we're going to go further from having a Cayman fund service in Ireland to setting up one of these new UCIT type funds in Ireland and maybe tapping into European distribution, we're going to set it up in Ireland, and the regulator and the government and business working hand in hand said, that's great, that's exactly what we want, that's the next stage of our development, but we want everything now serviced in Ireland with the exception of custody. So all the kind of inputting for NAV production, TA work and so on, all had to be done in Ireland. But as we became more and more successful, as the more and more funds launched, did it make sense to have overeducated, overpaid young people inputting when we could be controlling and managing the process and also freeing us up to have more of a client-centric role? So I always believed, before we eventually got rid of minimum activity, I always believed it had its day and we needed to move on. But it's getting me back to the point that I think all generalizations are wrong, but if I'm bold enough to make a generalization about the Irish people, I think we're particularly well suited for client-centric, client-facing roles. And I think that aided the development of the Financial Services Centre for sure.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like the minimum activities rule served a purpose for a while, and then ultimately, I think when UCITS 4 came and the management company passport became effective, then that kind of was the end of the minimum activities rule.
Yeah.
Or admin done here when a man goes with passport and do it from another jurisdiction. But it's interesting how the journey evolved, and I guess it doesn't sound like when you think about the thousands of people that work in the industry now, the households around the country that have bread put on the table as a result of the industry, that success wasn't inevitable.
No, it wasn't inevitable, nor is it guaranteed into the future, because I have strong views on that as well. We had to work really hard. I do remember the condescending comments that we would get from the audit firms, the legal firms in places like Luxembourg and so on, that, they're an interesting lot, the Irish, they will get up to speed eventually, but, if you want the Rolls Royce, of the industry, you go to Luxembourg. I remember reading some reports that were just unbelievable. I remember going to New York law firms and, making all the arguments as to why Ireland was the natural, obvious choice to domicile a new UCITS structure. And, the word processors that the firms in those days had Luxembourg at the top of the prospectus. And even though, they were sympathetic to the arguments, and the hardest thing in life is to change the status quo. It's like a big container type ship. To change course takes time. So we had to kind of plug away and so on. But, fundamentally, again, all generalizations are wrong, but fundamentally, the international investment funds industry is an English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon, common law type industry. And we tick all the boxes. So once we established our credibility, once we were able to demonstrate the infrastructure was there to attract, to retain, to service the business, to my mind now, I'm even more bullish and more strong on the view that Ireland is uniquely placed to capture the lion's share of the international investment business if it plays its cards right. So we had to overcome the status quo. We had to overcome, although those days were fading very quickly. Offshore UK was Jersey, Guernsey, the Channel Islands. So we had to, like anybody flying in and out of those places will realize why Dublin became so much of an attractive alternative. But we had to overcome kind of the preconceived notions as to how you deal with international investment business. It wasn't guaranteed. And, it's a tribute to all of us who were there from the start, who were plugging away at conferences, business development trips, and essentially was selling Ireland PLC first and then everything else. Now, I'd also have to pay tribute to our listing agencies, the Davies and the NCBs, because, when I started talking to people sometime in the early days about funds business in Ireland, say, oh, yeah, we've been doing business in Ireland, it's great, and so on. And when I drilled down, they weren't doing anything. All they were doing is getting their funds listed in Ireland. But even that act in itself just opened up Ireland, a market that should be investigated maybe a bit further. It was a foot in the door. So I do recall the pioneering work being done by our listing and NCB in particular, and on the back of that, working really hard to get Ireland off the ground in those days.
Yeah, and so we've looked back for that part of the chat. Look forward then, we have the Funds Sector 2030 review from the Department of Finance. So they're obviously looking forward to what does the future hold for the funds industry here in Ireland, and how do we bring the various stakeholders together to maintain the current position and hopefully grow and develop it. What do you think about I guess before we look at the review, the key risks to the industry here? What could go wrong?
Yeah, to me, it's like the British car industry. When I grew up as a young lad, the British car industry was by far and away reviewed or considered to be the premier car industry in the world. And the British people and British management believed that, and they sat back on their laurels, and now it's gone. So in business, but particularly international business, you got to keep running to stand still. Nobody deserves, you're not guaranteed a living for life. So you're going to earn it. And you're only as good as the next piece of business that you win. So we've a really good foundation, a really good reputation. We have a lot of good infrastructure factors working in our favor. But unless we show a hunger to continue to reinvent ourselves and to try and win that next piece of business, we will be replaced by others. There's no guarantee that we will continue at the forefront of all of this unless we continue to put in a huge amount of effort. If I look at the risks obviously are complacency, and good enough is good enough. If I look at the inordinate amount of time it took to enact legislation on the ICAV, which is now the vehicle of choice for corporate vehicles in the international investment funds industry, is almost criminal how long that took. If I've almost given up on investment limited partnerships. Eventually, we got a little bit of the investment limited partnership legislation passed, but there's so many iterations of that legislation. In Luxembourg, with the RAIF, unregulated investment limited partnership with regulated entities around it in the industry. The industry does not
Sorry,
stand
Gerry,
still.
you dropped out there for a second.
Constantly reinventing it.
Sorry,
did you? Can you hear
I
me?
lost you for a bit. Yeah, I've got you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good old band. Okay, so
you were saying about the registered AIF in Luxembourg.
Yeah, I'm just saying that, okay, we eventually enacted investment limited partnership legislation here, but how many iterations, how many updates have we had since then? Luxembourg has gone through so many iterations of their investment limited partnership legislation. They have the RAIF product, which is particularly well regarded by the international investment community, where it's an unregulated product but with regulated entities around it. And we need to be reinventing ourselves and looking at this all the time if we're going to stay relevant. So the concern always, Danny, is that good enough is good enough, and that, look, we'll focus as a government, as an industry, our attention on other areas. Every partnership that goes to Luxembourg, we've lost X% of a job. But when you multiply that by the hundreds or the thousands, that's a lot of jobs we've lost directly, and then indirectly, everybody that feeds off that as well. So I would just like to see that urgency come back again into trying to, with this world-class industry, with this leadership position we've attained, to recognize it's not set in stone. We've got to work real hard at trying to maintain that and even improve that going forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is complacency is the danger, and the sense that, well, we have an established industry, so we don't need to work as hard at being innovative and staying ahead of the curve. And I think, particularly when you think about the ICAV Act and the amendments to the Investment Limited Partnership, what strikes me about them is they're both really structural pieces of legislation. They're about how funds are structured. They're not about the risk that goes into funds. They're not about how funds are sold. They're not about consumer protection or financial stability. They're just about whether you structure your fund as a corporate, as an ICAV, as an investment limited partnership. So taking that long to get through a legislative process when you're not talking about those kinds of risks is just, there's something wrong when that happens. And I think that you're right in saying that that's something that needs to be looked at. This needs to get more priority. And I think across all of the political parties, it's one, you need to understand better where the risks are that you need to worry about and where the risks are you need to worry about as much, and that this is the kind of stuff that really is the mechanics of how the industry works. And it is important that this stuff gets through government and gets through the legislative process and gets through efficiently, because as much as anything else, and you mentioned the jobs that go to other jurisdictions as a result, it's also the tone that it sets and the tone that it allows to be set here and abroad if there's a perception that actually the focus and the care and attention that the industry used to get is no longer the case.
Yeah, no, I think that was very well, Danny. The analogy I would draw is with our planning authority here, which just seems to be not fit for purpose. So similarly, I'm not seeing, and I'm just seeing politicians being politicians, quite frankly. I'm not seeing a real commitment by anybody to our industry. There are not enough votes in it. There's not enough social media comment on it. So I'm just totally cynical with the process. It could be and it should be a lot better. And you know what? If we neglect it, in the years to come, our industry will not develop in the way it has over the years. There'll be others who, quite rightly, will be more hungry, working harder, that will do better than us. So we've got to continue to recognize that we're in a wonderful position. Let's not lose this position. Let's not be like the British car industry from years gone by, saying, aren't we wonderful? Isn't Ireland great? Look at all those wonderful educated people, but not reinventing ourselves to make sure that that continues to be the comment that we receive.
Yeah, I think you're right. You said about running to stand still. You're right. If you're not going forward, you're going backwards. There is standing still. And just for our listeners, in case anybody isn't familiar, so in April, the Department of Finance published the terms of reference for review of the fund sector, of Fund Sector 2030. And the intention with it is that it'll be a collaborative effort between the Department of Finance, the Revenue Commissioners, and the Central Bank of Ireland, where they have identified a number of themes that they're interested in investigating further as they think about what the industry looks like today and I guess what they would like it to look like in 2030. So part of it is scene setting and understanding the impact that the industry has at the moment, which is fine, I guess. It seems, to my mind, to cover the ground that say, Irish Funds does in their Indicon reports. But perhaps the department feels like it's important that they have their own verified source for that, which is their prerogative. And then it looks at some of the more technical sides. They talk about developing capital markets, and they're talking about, from a taxation perspective, looking again at things like REITs and Irish real estate funds. And ultimately, then they want to make recommendations on these areas so as to promote, this is what they say, so as to promote open markets, resilient markets, and developing markets in Ireland in the years ahead. So I guess broadly, it's to be welcomed that they are carrying out this study and that they're focusing in those areas.
Sure.
And what do you think then is a good outcome for the industry when this review is done? It'll take about 12 months, I'd say, maybe a bit longer. It is quite ambitious and will require different stakeholders coming together. But, when this gets done, what do you think a good outcome is?
Yeah, I guess I listen to all the good intentions. I listen to all the well-produced reports and so on. And I take it with a pinch of salt. Ultimately, I'd like to think I'm judged by my actions, and I definitely judge others by their actions. So really, what we need to see out of all of this is not setting up endless committees, not doing endless reviews, not producing endless papers, but, essentially action plans with short-term outputs so that, in 5 years, we may all be dead, and 50 years, we'll all be dead. So in 2 years is a long time. So what I think is that, of course, we need a plan, we need a framework, we need a vision. And all of this is really, really good. We need to turn the good intentions into actions. If you're going to give me a deliverable in 2 years, I'm just going to, focus on other things, because to me, the time scale is too long. Now, if it is a big project and realistically it's going to be 2 or more years, that's fine. These things happen. But there are going to be short-term deliverables along the way to give me comfort that what you're doing is credible and that we are proceeding along a route that will ultimately deliver the goods. I just think that complacency is the enemy of progress, of continued progress. We want to have that hunger to continue to improve, to continue to innovate, to continue to reach out. And we need to demonstrate by our actions that we're doing this. I'm a great believer that you can read all the works in the world about academically and theoretically why this went wrong or that went wrong or this didn't happen or that didn't happen. Like, who's done the post-mortem on the ICAF? Why in God's name did it take so many years? How do we ensure that that will never, ever, ever happen again? Who's done the post-mortem on the investment limited partnership legislation? How do we ensure that that never happens again? So I think part and parcel of credible planning ahead is to acknowledge where we have dropped the ball, where we haven't delivered, where we haven't done what we should have been doing. But lightning does strike twice. I believe that very firmly. Lightning does strike twice. Unless you do that forensic analysis of how and why you're disappointed these things didn't materialize the way you would have liked them to have done, you can rest assured that they will happen again. So all of this is good, Danny, but we just want to turn it into something that's, credible in terms of action. It's action that will change our lives, not words.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I know industry will often say, well, we'd like certainty. We'd like to know that the rule book is settled and we can plan around it. We can use that as our basis for what we're going to do for the next period of time. And I think, personally, I think that's unrealistic in a way, because generally when it comes to rulemaking is a reaction to something usually that's either gone wrong or there's been an innovation. So the only way the rule book stays the same today and in 5 years' time is if there have been no new developments, no new risks, and no misbehavior. And that's ideal, certainly in the last one, you'd hope that doesn't happen. But these things happen. That is the nature of the business. People are trying to innovate, do things differently, and that introduces risks next year that maybe we didn't have this year. So the rulebook will change. But I think the messaging that the key stakeholders on the government side are coming together to look at this and plan forward is good messaging. But I think you're right. I think we need to, where there are deliverables, they need to deliver quickly. And I think when it comes to legislation, particularly that is about the structure and the foundation as opposed to the key investment or investor protection risks, that really should be something that everyone can prioritize to get through quite quickly. It doesn't have to be a slog that we've seen for other pieces of legislation in the past. And I think that sets the right tone into the future, that it is something we're serious about, continuing to grow and foster and be very careful for and of. That's my take anyway, Gerry.
No, I agree. There's lots of constituencies in there, and we have to be realistic in a political world in which we live, and so on and so forth. It's like everything in life, Danny. It's got to be balanced. So good intentions, good planning, good reports, all of that's important, but let's not lose sight of turning that into action. And if a project is big, that's fine, but let's focus on the short-term deliverables to make sure it's credible then in terms of delivery dates and so on.
Well, we're coming to the end of our chat, and I know we've chatted about the review and the risks and what could go wrong for the industry, but you're a pretty positive guy. So let's wrap up on your take for the next kind of immediate future for the industry here. I guess you're pretty positive about what can be achieved.
I am. I think, we maybe stumbled into this incredible industry that I've been fortunate myself, most definitely, to have stumbled into, international financial services. I just don't see any end in sight. I think there is wealth accumulation, capital accumulation, and a big piece of it will want to find a home in the international financial world. And I think we have a world leadership position. I think we are in a very, very fortunate position. We've, at least another generation that has come through since I started out. And these are people that most definitely do know a mutual fund or investment fund from a hole in the ground. They are really talented, well-versed to participate in all aspects of the industry. I do believe that we cannot take anything for granted. And I do believe we've got to continue to get out there and to give positive messages and so on and so forth. I do feel ultimately it's the quality of the service we provide. So servicing is key. I'm not a great fan of the current situation where people work at home at their own choice and so on and so forth. I think we've got to be real careful to determine if that's having an impact on the way we service our business, if it's having an impact in the way we grow our future managers and talent. But ultimately, technology has served as well, and it's servicing us in this industry too. But, I think a contented client is a key objective here, and we've got to make sure that we win the business to begin with, but then we retain it by quality servicing and our client-facing skills. So I'm really positive about the industry, Danny. I think unless we shoot ourselves in the foot, I think we're just going to continue to go from strength to strength. The real issue is, are we going to achieve our full potential? And to do that, we've got to get real hungry again about the boundaries that we set and the targets that we set.
Gerry, I've been looking forward to having you on the show for a while now, so you've not let me down. Well done. Thank you very much for guesting on the Quest podcast.
You're very welcome, Danny. It's always good to talk.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Quest podcast. We'll catch you next time.
The Quest podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.